I'm going to speak for just a few moments and then throw it open to questions, so most of the time will be yours. One of the things I sometimes hear is if you get there to the Oval Office, how are you going to reach across the aisle? Everything's so poisonous in Washington. How are you going to do that? And the truth is, it doesn't cost anything to reach across the aisle. Right after I got in office for my first term, I walked down to the office in the State House of the Speaker of the House alone, by myself. Mr. Speaker, how about we get together, you and me and the President of the Senate, they were Democrats, I was a Republican, and we'll just have coffee and cookies once a week, say every Monday afternoon, and we'll get to know each other better. There's a lot I can learn from you guys, and it could be fun. He said, fine. I walk over to the Senate President's office, I say the same thing. Tea or coffee and cookies once a week, Monday afternoon. He says, fine. So we start doing this, and my theory was, if you know you're going to be having a meeting like that with someone within the next 7 days, it makes it tougher for you to stab them in the back on some legislative agreement or go to the press and say, this guy's a real jerk. And the result was that never happened in my 2 terms as governor. And it was such a good idea, in fact, I think anyone who was there or lived in Massachusetts since then would tell you it ushered in a golden era of good relations in the State House and in politics in Massachusetts that endures to this day. And the reason it endures to this day was because every one of the 5 governors who succeeded me has adopted exactly the same practice, and every Speaker of the House and every Senate President. Always across the aisle, and that practice is continuing until this very week. So it doesn't really cost anything, and it can produce great results. It also occurs to me that some of the knottiest problems facing our country today, that would be in almost anybody's first 100 days in office as president, certainly in mine, lend themselves to this kind of approach and this kind of resolution. First, certainly among the first couple would be the trillion-dollar deficits, and we didn't have that problem in Massachusetts because we got together and agreed on what revenues we expected for the year. And if you look at the Washington history, Alan Simpson of Wyoming and Erskine Bowles, the Republican and the Democrat, worked out a pretty good blueprint for how we should approach the budget down there. It's just, it was a very good blueprint. It didn't quite get adopted by Congress, but that shows that that type of issue is susceptible of that kind of analysis. Climate change, also in my first couple of issues that I would address, may seem like a complex issue, but if you think about it, preserving the shorelines of our country and every other country and making sure that we don't get just lambasted by severe flooding and atmospheric conditions that make all the storms we've seen in the last 5 or 10 years seem like a minor rain squall, that's not really a partisan issue. You should be able to get agreement that we want to do that. And the way to do that is simply to make less carbon go into the atmosphere. People think that the solution to climate change is to say, I'm going to spend 16 trillion on this, or I'm going to spend 12 or 20 trillion. And people are trying to outvie each other with how much money they're going to spend addressing climate change. But the question really is, how are you going to do it? And there's only one way to do it. And the way to do it is to put a price on carbon, which will be an incentive. It's an incentive to people who put carbon into the atmosphere, coal companies, oil companies, mining companies, to put less of it in, because it'll be expensive for them. And you put a price on it, and that could float up and down, and ultimately the market is going to respond to the pricing signal, and there will be an equilibrium with less carbon than there is now. And that's the only way you're going to prevent the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere from rising more than 1.5 degrees centigrade between now and 2050. And that's the only benchmark we have to hit. There's nothing in there about spending 10 or 15 or 30 trillion dollars. And we don't have to shoot Bessie the cow. We don't have to, stop taking airplanes. We don't have to commit economic suicide. All we got to do is put that price on carbon. And if ever there was a national emergency, indeed a planetary emergency, even though 2050 is a long way away, that's an emergency today. Unlike, say, a huge wall with metal walls with alligators and a moat between them on our southern border, not so much a national emergency. But this one would be, and I think it's entirely possible that the Supreme Court would agree that the President of the United States could handle this one by themselves. Far preferable if you can amass the votes in Congress to get agreement on this process, but it's a very simple thing. It's just arithmetic. You put a price per ton on carbon, say 20 or 40 or $50 per ton. You let it float up and down until the market determines the equilibrium. Problem solved. So that would be susceptible of bipartisan approach. A third area, internationally, Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, senator from Michigan, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, famously said when he was in office that partisan politics stops at the water's edge. And it always used to do so. And we should be able to get back there in an era that's less turbulent than the current one in Washington. And restoring good relations with our military allies is another area that should not be controversial. So virtually all these problems, which are major issues on top of the table right now, seem to me to lend themselves to the kind of approach that the Problem Solvers Caucus and No Labels are attacking. And I think they're just a huge force in politics today. And they're emblematic of everything that I've stood for, as the Admiral implied, over my entire career. And I look forward to working with all of you and with No Labels and giving them a high position in the councils of my administration if I'm fortunate enough to get there. So I'm just dumb enough to be smart enough to understand that I learn more when I listen to you than when I'm pontificating to you. So I'm going to leave that for my case in chief and open it up to questions from the floor now, and I hope you all have been primed and have some questions you'd like to ask me. Yes, sir.
How are you going to beat Trump?
How am I going to beat Trump? Well, it is no secret that the Republican state committees in each of the 50 states are pretty much appointed by Mr. Trump. They are the Trump organization. So you don't start there. Speaking broadly, I think my task is to enlarge the electorate of people who vote in the Republican primaries beyond just the party leaders and their close associates, to bring in many more women voters, for example, all women, not just moderate suburban women. I think all women should be alarmed at the assault on reproductive rights that's been enacted in state legislatures recently. Also, particularly if you think about the issues, younger voters, millennials are now our largest voting bloc, and Gen Xers right after them. They're the people with the most at stake, both in the trillion-dollar deficits annually, because they're never going to see Social Security if someone doesn't stop those trillion-dollar annual deficits, and in climate change, because they're the ones who are going to inhabit the world that is going to be changed beyond recognition if the polar ice cap is permitted to melt. And millennials and younger voters understand this. I'm so enthusiastic about them voting, as a matter of fact, that I propose that they be allowed to vote mobile voting with their cell phone. And I don't get up 10 times in the night to check this, I assure you. But this now recognizes my fingerprint. It recognizes iris, eye identification. You could vote, take a picture of yourself, a selfie while you're doing it, date stamp it, email it to your voting place. That's a heck of a lot more secure than someone walking in saying, my name is John Smith, I live on Leisurely Lane, I'm going to vote now, you don't know me, I don't know you, I'm not going to show you any ID, I gave you my name, that's enough. I think the mobile voting would be more secure. And if we had mobile voting, you know, this would unlock that millennial vote. In the last cycle, 49% of millennials voted, no more. You change that figure to 65% of millennials voting, the largest voting bloc, Donald J. Trump would not win a single primary in this country. Yes, ma'am. I'm going to wait for the mic here.
Governor, what will you do to fix the inadequacy of Social Security at $17,529 a year, and 50% of us are under that, and paying for the high cost of health care, while keeping it an earned benefit, because we've lost 1/3 of that stool. Basically, the pensions are all gone, and people are criticized for not saving for retirement, but you're trying to survive in the system. And tied into that, the for-profit get as much as we can. Housing, whether it's a house or it's apartments, are very inadequate.
The question, as I understood, was principally about Social Security. Obviously, the Social Security Trust Fund has to be restructured, and that's a complex enterprise and undertaking. But there's some things that can be done to jumpstart that process. I think, you know, if 60 is not the new 40, it's at least the new 50. And I think raising the retirement age should not shock the conscience of the populace. People really are living longer and working longer. Myself, I think a means test is not offensive either. I understand that everybody had to pay in, and some people want to hold on to every last nickel they can. But people who really don't need that check, I think they really don't need it. And there are a lot of people who don't need that check. You know, it was set up originally so it was supposed to replace the income that you didn't have anymore. But boy, from the checks I see, it don't nearly go halfway there. And so I think the checks for everybody else could be larger if we had a change in the means test as well, accepting a means test. The last thing I think you could make the Social Security tax be based on or apply to a larger amount of income than it is now, so people would pay in more from the beginning on as they went along. So those are three ideas. In the back, yellow.
First of all, Governor, I want to thank you and the other presidential candidates for coming today, because obviously a lot of them didn't show.
Hey, this is New Hampshire, and this is a very good-looking crowd, so thank you.
I'm from New Hampshire, No Label Problem Solvers, and in the handbook that everybody got, there's 8 issues that are talked about. The one that has gotten me excited right from the beginning in terms of no labels is the national debt. How big of a national debt do we have to get before people will say it's too big? And then obviously the follow-up question is, what could you do to help stop it from getting that big?
Yeah, the question is about the national debt. It was $20 trillion when Mr. Trump came into office. It's now, with the multi-year budget that he filed a while ago, scratching up against $30 trillion. I believe this year we got to a $1 trillion deficit faster than in any previous year. There are no fiscal conservatives in Washington, D.C. The president is not an economic conservative. People accuse me of being a rhino, a Republican in name only, because I'm pro-choice on the question of reproductive rights. I would think somebody who is not an economic conservative is the one who's a Republican in name only, because the party has stood for that for a long time. So the Admiral mentioned that I was ranked the most fiscally conservative governor in the United States during my terms in office, and that was in Massachusetts, coming right after 3 terms of Michael S. Dukakis. So it was kind of a man bites dog story at the time. But the way you do that is by not respecting so-called sacred cows in the budget, and by not starting out every year, as they do in Washington, saying, what was the appropriation last year? Let's see how we can jigger that up a little bit. Washington, D.C. is the only town I'm aware of where last year plus 10% equals a cut. Anything less than that, and people scream like stuck pigs that that's a cut. So I had a slight advantage when I came into office. It was my first elective office, so I didn't know that there were sacred cows in the budget. I didn't even know that they were cows, much less that they were sacred. So we started out every budget cycle doing what's called zero-based budgeting. It means you sort of start, well, I'm glad to see familiarity with that concept. I wish it was more broadly familiar in Washington. So you start out every year with every item in the budget starts presumptively at zero, depending on how it performed last year. So let's say there was a preventive health measure in the budget that created a lot of good health outcomes and saved a lot of money and didn't do anything wrong. You might want to take that appropriation and multiply it by 5, because you want to promote those good outcomes. But let's say, and this is not a counterfactual example, let's say there's a bureaucracy in there that nobody can quite tell you what it does, except that it's very popular because it was associated with some highly popular senator 2 generations ago who set up the whole program, yada, yada, yada. Guess what? That goes to 0. That's why it's called zero-based budgeting. So you make big cuts where they're not being productive. So it's the same mistake that people make throughout government a lot. They measure inputs instead of outcomes, and we should always keep our eye on the ball of what is the budget supposed to do? What populations is it supposed to reach? With what services? And yardsticks like that can be measured. And if you do zero-based budgeting, it's very easy to balance that budget and not have a deficit. I came into office on January 3 of my first year. My budget was due February 28. So I had to close a 16% gap in the budget in less than 2 months, and it was child's play. It was not difficult. You just had to have the political will to make those cuts where the budget was not getting the job done. And you do that for a few years, and that accumulated deficit is going to start to go like that. And I agree with those who say that the accumulated deficit and the $1 trillion annual deficits is a national security issue, because we have to rely on other countries to come buy our treasuries, or we're going to go bankrupt as a country. And governments can go bankrupt. When I came into office, the head of administration and finance for the prior regime declared in January of the election year, Massachusetts is bankrupt. We're not able to meet our debts as they mature. A very honest thing to say, and I was heard to repeat that a time or two during my campaign. But it can happen, and we don't want to press this one the way we've been doing. Yes, ma'am. Right there, in red.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I'm a young voter. I'm still in school. And I think consistently with my peers, what we see are individuals who are being drawn to the extremes, specifically on the far left, because they've been able to capitalize on the messaging of justice and equity in a way that people in the center have not been able to do. So my question for you is, how can we take this centerline empirical approach to policy and make it more attractive to young voters who are more motivated by this passionate approach?
How could we? So when I think of the center, I think of someone who's economically responsible, a fiscal conservative, but socially totally open and supportive of everybody. And that's the duty of the President of the United States. You know, President Nixon was removed from office because he didn't take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Very specific part of the oath that the president takes. I've come to the view that the president has a more general duty of caring, and that's to care for everybody in our society. And I did that when I was governor. I appointed commissions of Hispanic Americans, African Americans, Asian, you name it, even Muslim. I met with them. Give me ideas for people who would be good members of the cabinet, who part of your group. Give me ideas of who should be a judge. And everybody felt like they were included. And it is kind of the opposite of what we got in Washington, D.C. now, where we have an administration that seeks to divide the United States and set everybody's teeth on edge. And it's just, I worry about social cohesion in this country. And it's why I've increasingly been worried about income inequality. Because in a country where the leadership is trying to stoke resentment of all kinds, and that was the campaign of 2016, I worry that income inequality can breed real resentment according to income level, not just immigration and race and all that poppycock. And that would be bad for the United States of America. I think that you can make a case for some income redistribution on prudential grounds as well as moral grounds. So that's the kind of center that I cleave to. I call myself a New England Republican, meaning fiscally conservative and socially open and tolerant and welcoming and supportive. And in New England, at least, people know what I mean. So I hope to see many more of you on the trail, and it's a great honor and a privilege to be with you today. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you.